Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 83 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a dingy room in a house in West London. The room is cluttered with junk, including boxes, suitcases, old newspapers, a rolled carpet, and planks of wood. Upstaged, a stained gas cooker stands disconnected, and a mound of more junk is piled on top of an iron bed. A stepladder, a kitchen sink, a shopping trolley, even a lawnmower. A man wearing a leather jacket sits silently on a second iron bed. He slowly looks around the room, taking in each object. A door bangs, and muffled voices are heard. The man stands, moves furtively to the door, and goes out. After some moments, the door opens and two men enter, the younger one putting the key in his pocket. The shabby attire of the older man suggests he may live on the streets. This is the downbeat and slightly mysterious opening of Harold Pinter's breakthrough play, The Caretaker. Set entirely in this single dilapidated room, the play presents the psychological maneuverings between these three men in what we now recognize as Pinter's cryptic mix of comedy and menace, delivered with his characteristic relish in the precision and panache of language. The Caretaker premiered at the Arts Theatre Club in London's West End in April 1960, transferring to the Duchess Theatre, where it ran for 444 performances, and then to Broadway. A film version of the play followed in 1963. The success of The Caretaker changed its author's life. As we record this episode, a new production of the play has opened at the Chichester Festival Theatre, directed by Justin Audibert. And I'm delighted to say that Justin joins me today to help us interpret Pinter's enigmatic work. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Justin. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Douglas. Really great to be here and talk about this brilliant play.
Great. Justin Audibert is the new artistic director of the Chichester Festival Theatre, one of the country's most illustrious producing theatres. Justice was previously the artistic director of the Unicorn Theatre, and his other directing credits include productions at the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Theatre, Southwark Playhouse, Soho Theatre, and many more. The Caretaker is his first production at Chichester since being appointed. So I'm bound to start by asking you, Justin, why did you want to direct this play as your first outing? And, as a corollary to that question, I suppose, what is it about this play written more than 60 years ago that still speaks to us today?
Thanks, Douglas. So I might answer that the other way around, if that's okay. And I might say what speaks about the play today. As you so eloquently read out in the introduction, the opening stage directions, everything in this play happens in this room, which you would say is derelict, run down. And it's a play about three characters who are all on the margins of society, three outsiders. And Pinter, obviously, very enigmatic about what he said his plays were about and would change his mind and so on. So the thing that I was really interested in that he said about it was he said it's a play about love of one's brother, love of home. Now, it feels like we've lived in a moment of huge social isolation, partly enforced through the pandemic. And this is a play about three very isolated people trying to connect. So in that sense, it felt like an incredibly relevant play for this moment. Why I wanted to direct it at Chichester Festival Theatre. So we have two theatres. We have the Festival Theatre, which is a 1,300 seat thrust stage. And we have the Minerva, which is a 310 seat thrust stage. And in my first season, what I really wanted to do was to celebrate the architecture of the two buildings. And this play is perfect because you feel like you're in a room that you shouldn't be in. What I wanted to do was do a play which was really all those brilliant architectural things about the Minerva, the sense of closeness, about seeing the sweat perspiring off people's brows, or in this case, seeing the dirt on those newspapers or the marks on the cooker. I wanted to lean into that in terms of the experience, but thematically it felt so of the moment because it's about people who fall through the cracks of society. So those are the kind of big overarching artistic director reasons, if that makes sense. The personal reason was I've never directed a Pinter play. I've loved them. And the thing of getting in a room with three amazing actors and just interrogating the text and going, very few people in this play say exactly what they mean at any given point. And as a director, that is such joy and fun to excavate like an archaeologist, the subtext. He was an actor who wrote three amazing parts for three actors, and that's a joy.
Yeah, well, we'll get to what it means. As you say, he was notoriously elusive about that. And I found that quote when he said it's about love. But it seems a highly unlikely thing to say in certain ways, because when you talk about these characters being isolated and maybe looking for some connection, in some ways, though, they're not very nice to each other. But they certainly share, as you say, the fact that they're on the margins of society. I'd like to start at the top. I somewhat sketchily described these three men in this rundown room. But for those who don't know the play and may not get a chance to see your production, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about who these characters are and a brief synopsis of the play, such as it is. Now, I'm bound to give my usual warning at this point that we're inevitably going to give away spoilers here. So for listeners who are looking forward to seeing Justin's production in Chichester still, you might want to turn off now and come back and listen afterwards. Or perhaps I could say that you're carrying on listening may enhance your appreciation of the show. Either way, we're going to plow on. So you've had the warning. So, Justin, can we just do a brief summary of what goes on between these three men in this room?
Absolutely, Douglas. So, when you read the stage direction, there's someone on stage and then they leave. That is a character called Mick. And in as far as we can trust anything that people say, it would appear that Mick is the owner of this property. And the two people coming up the stairs, one of them is Aston, who emerges is Mick's brother. And the other one is Davies, who is a man, which, as Pinter alludes to, who at least spends some of his time sleeping rough and living on the streets. Aston has seen Davies about to be attacked in a cafe and has kind of saved him from a punch-up and brought him back to this apartment to get his breath for a minute and to kind of calm down. And Mick, as he's heard the voice up the stairs, he's left the room. Sorry, I should say the ages, shouldn't I? That's helpful. So Mick is in his 20s, Aston is in his 30s, and as Pinter says, Davies is an old man. Davies then proceeds to tell you a lot about himself, and you quickly ascertain that he's not a person who follows an entirely logical chain of thought. He expresses a lot of views that today we would consider deeply unacceptable, racist, sexist, xenophobic. And Aston doesn't speak very much in this opening scene. What he does spend a lot of time doing is fixing a plug, or spending a time trying to fix a plug. And towards the end of that first scene, Aston offers Davies to stay in the room with him. And Davies stays, and that is the setup. Then it's the next day, and Aston is going to go out because he's getting things that he says he needs to renovate this building. Davies thinks he will have to leave with him, and Aston says you can stay there, and he leaves him in the room. And then Mick re-enters the room silently and catches Davies, looking like he's scoping the room out to steal things. And then follows an amazing sequence where Mick essentially tortures Davies, but he does it predominantly not physically, predominantly with words.
There's no logical questions. Mick doesn't say, who is this guy? What's he doing here?
No.
There's none of this obvious explanation between them.
No. And at this point, Davies does not know who this man that's grabbed him, thrown him to the floor, assaulted him. He doesn't even know who this person is. And we, the audience, at that point, don't know who he is. Then Aston reveals that's his brother and that he's the landlord and he's here to do up the house for his brother on behalf of his brother. There then follows a sequence where Aston offers Davies, hence the title, the position of being the caretaker in this place. And Davies thinks about this, but we have learnt that Davies maybe isn't who he says he is, or he goes around on an assumed name. Then Mick returns and offers to make Davies the caretaker of the premises. I suppose the other thing that's driving this is Aston recounts this experience he had when he was younger, whereby he was subjected to electric shock therapy treatment.
That somewhat explains, I suppose, a little bit of his behavior to date, his quietness, his distraction, his sort of obsessive focus on trying to fix a plug of an electric toaster and not really being normally responsive to Davies.
Yeah. And then in the second half, it opens with Mick and Davies on stage together, and they seem to be getting on really well, surprisingly. And both of them seem to complain about Aston and that Aston's a problem, that he's not working hard enough.
This house is not getting done up, is it?
House is not getting done up. And you think, oh, this is really interesting. So the power dynamic has shifted, and actually no longer is it Aston and Davies getting close. It's now Mick and Davies getting close. And then it comes to a massive head between the three of them. And you're not sure who is in support of who. And at the end, you are very clear where things stand.
Yes. And what is the likely future of Davis in this place? He's been offered the role independently of the caretaker by both the brothers, but it's a role which on the surface looks completely ludicrous. This is a derelict house. That's great. Now, I wanted to ask you, I was interested in where Pinter found the inspiration or idea for these characters and the setting of the play. Can you tell us anything about the source of where the play came from him?
Yeah. So he is quite specific about this. So he and his wife, Vivian Merchant, had just moved into a house on Chiswick High Road in West London. And on another floor, there was a man who he says was the kind of inspiration for Aston. He didn't talk much. He was a handyman, and he had a brother who was in the building trade. And one night he brought home a man that he had assumed was homeless. And the man stayed there for a couple of weeks. And then one day he was no longer there. I don't think Pinter knows whether there was conflict between the three of them or any of that. He's then taken that scenario and reimagined what happened in that relationship.
I read that he occasionally got glimpses of this man in the other room, and that the image stayed with him for a long time. And the image was of these two men standing in different parts of the room doing different things. The tramp, as he calls him, rooting around in a bag, and the other man looking out of the window and simply not speaking. A kind of moment frozen in time that left a very strong impression, he said. What's interesting is I read elsewhere, he made a famous comment on the source of three of his major plays, which points to the possibility of a single image like this being a starting point. So he said, I went into a room and saw one person standing up and one person sitting down. And a few weeks later, I wrote the room. I went into another room and saw two people sitting down. And a few years later, I wrote the birthday party. I looked through a door into a third room and saw two people standing up, and I wrote the caretaker. It's typical Pinter, that, isn't it? Doesn't give a lot away, but the idea, he says, that he starts from a particular image, not with a theme in mind or anything, and builds everything from there. It's extraordinary, really.
Absolutely. And the thing that you realize working on the play is everything in there has been so precisely and specifically chosen, as in the actual physical objects in the room. To start with, you would look at our set and you'd be like, oh, there's so much stuff. How can things be so specific? But then as they're being picked up and used, then you get how specific they are. I mean, the thing I didn't talk about in the synopsis, but there's a recurring theme that Davies has to get down to Sidcup, because then the papers that contain his identity are held there by someone else. So that would be his real identity. And then he'd be able to sort his life out and have a fixed abode and have a steady job. That's what in his mind is going on anyway. But he hasn't got any shoes, so he can't walk down to Sidcup. And there's obviously a moment in the play where a pair of shoes are presented and they ping out in such an amazing way.
Well, shoes become quite important. You're right, actually. And I wanted to talk to you about the structure and form of the play, because having seen it and then reread it, the more I appreciated how neatly he structures the progress of the play towards the ultimate fate of these three characters. It's in a way a triangular battle that unfolds, and it may feel random, but is very carefully worked out, isn't it?
It really is. He wrote three amazing parts for actors, and he kind of wrote a giant acting exercise. One of the first things you do in drama school are a range of exercises to show who is getting what they want at any given moment. And you could look at the caretaker and go, he's just written that exercise in loads of different ways for an hour and 50 minutes. Who is on top? Who is getting what they want? Who is not getting what they want? Who is saying what they mean? Who is not saying what they mean?
Yes, because I think the reality is it's not all on the surface of the text. What's going on in the relationships between them and the maneuvering between them, as you say, it reminded me as an exercise I did in a director's course where there was a line of chairs in a row, and through the scene you had to work out where they were sitting in relation to each other and how they were moving and who was on top and who was not. And that's basically what's going on here.
That's the play, yeah.
He carefully works out what the pattern of that progress is going to be of those relationships to ending where it does. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about was that there seem to be real life sources, as we talked about, and there's a really strong sense of the reality of this room. You talked about all the physical objects, and we're very immersed in that, and it's very tangible. But on the other hand, there's some element of this thing that feels very unreal. You know, the way these characters speak and behave toward each other is at times bizarre. It's kind of mystifying. It's not entirely natural, is it? It's certainly ambiguous, challengingly ambiguous. So how would you describe what he's doing with the form of this play?
So there are rhythmical things that he does which have shades of Beckett, shades of musical, shades of front cloth acting, as it were, like direct moments with the audience. The interesting thing I would say about the dialogue is, so the first scene with Mick and Davies, Mick is talking about the bus routes around London, and he's using this to go, I am a million times smarter than you. I know London like the back of my hand. I know every inch of it. Wherever you think you've been as a homeless man, I've been there and I know it. I know who you are and exactly what you're trying to do in this room. But actually, if you sat at a bus stop and listened, that is a bit how people talk. People often do speak in non sequiturs. I mean, my mum's side of the family are all proper EastEnders. And it was funny, my mum came to see the show and the cast were like, your mum would be in a Pinter play. Because, it's not always people saying exactly what they mean. And he just captures that. But imagery wise, there are lots of things where he's absolutely leaning on other traditions. There's a sequence where Davies gets given a red smoking jacket. And bear in mind, he's got broken down sandals on his feet and holes in his clothes and everything else. He suddenly puts this smoking jacket on. And I mean, it's the most Charlie Chaplin, Little Tramp kind of, it's in that vaudeville kind of thing. And he's playing with that stuff all the time. The one really explicit lighting instruction he obviously gives is when Aston is doing this huge monologue about the electric shock therapy. Pinter's very clear on that. For lots of the show, you would say that we light it in a naturalistic manner. Essentially, we are looking at a version of naturalism in it, telling time of day and place and everything coming from one light bulb, even if it doesn't, but, the idea that it does. But Pinter's very explicit. He says the whole space should gradually close down and there should be long shadows across the back wall. And Davies is on stage at the back, sat listening by the window, and Aston is in the middle of the stage. And suddenly we get a close up into Aston's brain and imagination and mind and soul. It's a really specific change in the theatrical language, which then again, you go away from. The second half, you're back in the world of a light bulb lighting the room.
It's a wonderful moment, not just because of the speech, but you're right, because it isolates Aston as he was when he went through this experience as well, of course. But you said earlier, I think, that nobody in a Pinter play ever says what they mean. That whole speech that Mick very early on starts by listing all these locations around London, which he, as you say, he's saying he knows better than Davies. And this language is being used as a form of intimidation. It's being used as a weapon of power, isn't it? I mean, there are times when these normal questions, he says, what's your name? Did you sleep here last night? That sounds all very normal, except he repeats it 3 or 4 times in a quite aggressive way. It's definitely a form of intimidation and attack. Pinter also said it's about who is most dominant at any one time. And Mick, of course, is saying, I'm dominant here. This is my place. And even London is my place. So, yeah, it's the language, as you say, it's not just what they say. In fact, the very first speech Mick says is almost completely absurd. He starts talking about his uncle's brother being a long jump specialist who had a penchant for nuts and used to bat number 4 for Beckenham reserves and played the fiddle, and who he says Davies is the spitting image of. I mean, it's just craziness.
It's absolutely crazy. I mean, like, won an Olympic medal, got kicked out of the Salvation Army. None of it makes sense at all.
So what's he doing?
For my mind, at that point, he is just continually throwing Davies off guard, off balance. Like, you can't follow me. In a way, verbally, it's like Muhammad Ali. He's just sting, sting, jab, jab, jab. He puts him so off guard by being so difficult.
Why is he that aggressive? Because he comes across, I think we might initially think, as disproportionately aggressive. He's much younger, stronger.
Yep.
We've already seen that his brother has invited Davies in. He doesn't know that, of course, but he really goes to town on him. I mean, it's both verbal and, you said, a certain amount of physical threatening abuse going on here. So what is his motive? Where is this aggression coming from?
So it goes back to the first thing I said, which is, I think he really does love his brother, Aston. And I think he sees that Davies is a potential threat, someone who might take advantage of his brother, someone who might be up to no good, someone who might be taking his brother for a ride. He knows his brother has a good, generous nature, although he's never done anything like this before. And so his version of love is this kind of alpha male aggressive behavior. And it's very notable. Whenever Davies talks derogatorily about Aston, Mick will pick him up on it. He will absolutely suddenly go to town on him about it. But in scenes between Mick and Aston, you never see Mick say anything nice, kind, generous, loving. But at the same time, he won't let anyone else ever attack him, demean him, belittle him. And obviously the denouement of the play revolves around a moment where Davies oversteps the mark in the way that he talks to Aston, and Mick will not stand for that in any way, shape, or form.
It's interesting you say that about him not saying nice things about his brother. And in fact, I read one analysis that suggested that Mick deliberately sets out to test and provoke Davies, to trap him into betraying Aston by inviting Davies in some way to ingratiate himself with him, for example. And that surprised me a little bit. Do you think that really was a conscious strategy of Mick's?
So I do think Mick wants to get rid of Davies. But I think what Mick wants Aston to grow smart, street smart enough, wise enough, strong enough to do it himself. Mick is trying to, in his own slightly eccentric manner, to empower Aston to be a forceful agent in his own life and to get rid of Davies and to get on with renovating this house. But he's at the same time not going to let Aston be taken advantage of. But I do think he's trying to get Aston to seize his own destiny.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Mick gets Davies' number from the start, right?
Agreed.
He identifies the threat he represents and that he's basically a fraud and a scrounger out for anything he can get. And he, I think, sets him up. But as you say, on the basis ultimately that Aston himself recognizes this too. It's interesting because all of this sounds like it's a quite fierce battle between them and it's a pretty sordid setting and all that, but it's also very funny. And some of the comedy comes from the language, the way that they're talking in seemingly absurd terms at times, and also that it doesn't match their circumstances. It's true that Pinter did say, as far as I'm concerned, the caretaker is funny up to a point. Beyond that point, it ceases to be funny, and it is because of that point that I wrote it. But it also has something, I guess, about the comedy of menace, because we talk about the menace that initially, particularly Mick represents towards Davies. But it's both menacing and funny.
I mean, I would argue that the thing that Pinter kind of invents, I suppose, is the idea that you are laughing and then you suddenly are still laughing and you realize you should have stopped a few seconds ago. And you feel it in the audience. You feel that there are so many moments where they're laughing and they go, oh, I've laughed a bit longer than I meant to laugh because that's now not funny.
No, and that's quite cruel. Or
that's cruel. And am I cruel because I've laughed at that? That feels like that's what he's trying to do all along. And I also feel like Davies says and does, I think, loads of things we would probably think of as relatively despicable. But at the same time, I couldn't help but have an enormous amount of empathy for him. And without wanting to give the ending away, at the end, I feel very sorry for Davies. I think he's his own worst enemy. The interesting thing is, Aston is the character in the play, I would say, that changes. And he does grow in a way. I would say Mick and Davies don't change. Whereas I think Aston, I think he has changed and grown and become assertive in a certain small, narrow way.
That's really interesting. We'll come to that at the end. Yeah, he is, as you say, his own worst enemy in some respects. But sticking with Mick, for the most part, initially, we just get the power of him in this triangle and how he's distrustful of Davies and protective of his brother. But what else does he want in his life? I think that's a really interesting question because there's some teasing things that he says that you wonder, so where is he coming from? And as you say, does he grow or not? Well, that's partly about what is his own idea of himself.
I think the Caretaker is a play about the 1950s, London in the 1950s. But I do think, not that this is a conscious thing, I think Mick is rock and roll, right? Mick is the coming decade, as it were. And obviously rock and roll starts in 55. So you could argue that Mick is that. He is that energy of youth and change and social mobility and, the kind of swagger of the 60s. It feels to me that's what Mick is. I mean, this is my pop psychology, but I can't help but think there's a little bit of Pinter himself in Mick. That kind of thrusting, highly intelligent, held down by society person just busting to, as he says himself, I'm full of ideas. I've got ideas for this place,
But do you believe he's going to get anywhere? I had more of a strong sense that that's all very well, but I don't really hold out all that much hope for how much he's going to achieve.
Well, it's really interesting, right? Because he's got a business, he's got a van. I think that's true. Those things are said. So I think those things are true. He's tried to do this brother a chance to do something, make something of himself. His brother's not achieving it. I don't think Mick is going to achieve all of his dreams of his teal blue linoleum parchment squares and so on and so forth. But I do think Mick's going to find a way in society to climb. I do think that.
That's interesting because you mentioned that teal blue stuff is basically it's a reference to, he has this wonderful speech, which again is just, the language is fantastic, where he describes in very precise terms this impossibly stylish decoration of a penthouse he dreams of creating in this house, and that he envisions that Aston will help him create, which, I think the reality is we know that that is not going to happen.
It's never going to happen.
Aston's not capable of it, but his vision of it is just extraordinary. The language, what he describes, and I can't resist just reading some of this because it's so beautiful. He envisions a kitchen with teal blue, copper, and parchment linoleum squares, with these colors re-echoed on the walls, offset with kitchen units with charcoal gray worktops. And in the dining room, you have an off-white pile linen rug, a table in Afromosia teak veneer, sideboard with matte black drawers, curved chairs with cushioned seats, armchairs in oatmeal tweed, a beech frame settee with woven seagrass seat, white-topped heat-resistant coffee table, white tile surround. Now, it's all completely crazy when you see what they're actually living in, but it's completely joyous too, isn't it? Celebration of language, imagination, of dream. It's poetry.
So Pinter was actually obsessed with interiors. So Stephen Brimson Lewis, who is the designer, he did play with Pinter himself as the director. And Pinter was absolutely fascinated by wallpaper, furniture, tablecloths. He was so particular about it.
It feels authentic, even though it's sort of a crazy vision, and it's just beautifully written. And it's interesting because it also reveals some side to Mick that we haven't seen because he's been so aggressive. And then it's this kind of really sensitive description of an interior decoration dream he's got. And you're going, wow, where did that come from?
So I think there's a really political thing here, which is one of the amazing things that Pinter does, is he really does give poetry to working class voices.
That's true.
Working class characters have an ability to go at times into the poetic realm. And it's kind of an underlooked aspect of the way that he writes. But I think it's a very political choice that he makes. It's no coincidence to me that Aston, the most monosyllabic of the three characters, has the most verbose speech. He talks about this traumatic experience and he can find words which still feel absolutely truthful to Aston, but he can find words that bring a tear to your eyes or a shiver to your spine.
I think that's a really great point because there's something about class, even in the sense that he allows Mick to have this dream that you wouldn't credit was possible.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about Davies, as you touched on before, about where he ends up and how you feel about him. He is this mixture of both bravado and vulnerability, isn't he? I think you get the idea that he's been kicked around a bit before. He's kicked around the town, of course, but he's also been kicked down by others. And he's the chancer. He's taking his chance here. But he's also mainly the weakest of the three, isn't he? Although Aston doesn't say much, and Mick is clearly very powerful and has the makings of him, is it not right that Davies feels the weakest in the maneuverings throughout this triangular battle?
I think his plan, he knows that he's weak, so he tries to find the strongest person and side with them. He's that classic thing of a kid that sucks up to the bully to hope to not be bullied, but will still end up getting bullied, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
He has moments of charm, and then he'll always do something that is pretty repulsive. He is a person, if you give him an inch, he will take that mile and some.
It is interesting that we get towards the end when the balance of that feeling or empathy you have for him, it's hard to feel any most of the time, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, he says literally dreadful things. But he also, the other brilliant thing that Pinter does is Pinter does make him funny. And actually, that does make you feel warm towards him because he has made you laugh. There's real joy in him trying on those shoes or the smoking jacket or, sitting down with his pipe that he never lights. And that's in the script. He never lights the pipe. So strange.
So tell me, you touched earlier about the fact that he has an assumed name. And we discover early on his real name is Mac Davies, but he's gone under the name of Bernard Jenkins for the past 15 years. And then he left, as he refers to, his papers that verify his name with a man in Sidcup, another one of those place names, but it has something to do with stamps he's got on a card under his assumed name. It's all a bit ambiguous, and I don't know whether it would mean more in the time that it was written, but what is the significance of the fact that he's not going by his real name?
So the stamps he's talking about is a national insurance card, which so basically proof that he's worked and then is entitled to benefits if he's not working. And of course, he's got stamps proving he's worked as Bernard Jenkins, but his name is actually Mac Davies and his papers are somewhere else. So I mean, they may entirely not be his stamps. Who knows whether those Bernard Jenkins stamps are for work that he did, or whether he just took someone called Bernard Jenkins's card that had some stamps on it. And then the brilliant thing that you get as kind of another recurring motif is that, he can't get to his papers because they're down in Sidcup and it's difficult to get to Sidcup when it's raining. And then you find out at a given point that they've been down there for 15 years. Well, it hasn't rained for 15 years.
He's blaming the weather repeatedly for the fact he can't get to Sidcup. So yeah, I guess you never really know what's going on or where this name came from and why. But I suppose it's a symbol of his delusions about sorting himself out that he'll get to Sidcup. And how does he define himself and his identity?
So there's a really interesting things here, which is Bernard Jenkins is a very Welsh name. Mac Davies is a Welsh name. Mac is a very Scottish name. And he talks quite a lot about them not wanting foreigners and they want an Englishman to pour their tea. And the references to being in the colonies. He pretends he's English with his half Scottish, half Welsh name. He spends a lot of time talking about Poles, Greeks, blacks, highly racialized language. And yet there is ambiguity about, he gets asked at various points directly, where was he born? And he says he can't remember. It's been a long way back. This is all very deliberate. Pinter is going, this person who espouses these xenophobic, racist things, who are they themselves? He espouses those views because his life has been incredibly difficult. And, he wants to think in his mind that he is, in inverted commas, better than other people.
But he's not legitimate. He's a fraud of sorts, isn't he?
He's not legitimate. He's a fraud. Exactly.
Ultimately, of course, he makes the mistake of switching his allegiance from Aston to Mick. As you said earlier, is basically who is the most powerful that I can get on my side. And that's a fatal mistake. What about Aston? Let's talk about Aston, who's in some ways the most fascinating character, isn't he? We sense from the start, because we don't know what's happened to him, why he is the way he is, that he's unusual, living in this dilapidated room for a start, and he's hoarded all this junk. He's very quiet in his exchange with Davies, and he doesn't appear to have a job or go out very much. He's both fragile, and there is also, though, a silent strength to him.
Yeah, I totally think that. There's an element to which he kind of seems happy going out around London, chatting to people in secondhand shops and car boot sales and other such things, and picking up saws and stockpiling wood in the garden to build his shed, which is his dream. Again, Pinter gives everyone a dream.
Yes.
And then, as we talked about, this devastating, incredible piece of writing where he recounts to Davies, the reason he doesn't talk to people often out in public is because he did talk to people and then he ended up being taken to a psychiatric hospital and given a treatment, in inverted commas, of electric shock therapy. And the damage that did to him afterwards, he felt his thoughts were slow, his balance was unsteady. It's alluded that he attempted to take his own life, where he says, I should have died. I got all my things out and I laid them all out and I should have died. It's not explicitly said, but whether he didn't go through with it, tried, or someone found him.
Or they should have killed him instead of leaving him like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's ambiguous, but he feels that he's definitely had a brush with his mortality in whatever way.
It's an absolutely incredible speech. It's so vivid and harrowing, of course, because you see everything he goes through. He describes it so vividly. Being incarcerated, that he tried to escape, and that he'd seen what had happened to other patients, so he knew what was coming, and he physically fought, had to be pinned down. And also, even more poignantly, he'd written to his mother because they had to have her permission and that she had agreed to it.
That's the bit that gets you, doesn't it?
Oh, my God.
He thinks he's got an intellectual response, which is, you can't do this to me. I'm a minor. And the guy turns around and goes, I've got your mother's permission. And that's the, ugh.
Oh, that's so much of the innocent being trammeled, isn't it? A terrible injustice is being done without accountability, it would appear. And what's interesting as well is that you think about the fact that they're brothers and the mother, what this also meant to Mick, therefore what he feels about Aston.
It's the key thing, right? Aston says he goes then back to the flat and he lived with Mick. And Mick has seen his brother come back in this very altered condition. And the other thing is, it's shocking to us now, but actually it would be shocking at the time because you know what, that was going on and that was happening to people and no one was going. Maybe we shouldn't be giving people electric shock therapy.
Yes, it was hard from his account to understand what it is was wrong with him, but he says he talked too much at work or in the cafe. And yes, he may have been eccentric and maybe he had mental illness of some kind. Of course, we don't know. But the treatment seems,
More problematic than the condition, yes.
yeah, potentially. We don't know. But it's very poignant, of course, as he says at one stage and throughout, doesn't he, Justin, that he can work with his hands. So his idea that he can build the sheds, he can work with his hands, which is basically saying the reverse. I can't work with my mind. I have to work with my hands.
Absolutely.
And actually, the really terrible thing is he doesn't look like he's very good at working with his hands.
No, I mean, he's still fixing a plug 3 weeks later from the start of the play. So
Exactly. Now, you talked about Davis making some blatantly racist comments at times. And I wanted to ask you specifically about this, Justin, because to our ears in the 21st century, these jump out at us as pretty shocking. They remind us that the play was written in different times. But what do you think we're to make of these racist statements now? When they land there in the theater, what do you think's happening with the audience?
it has a really interesting reaction in the room every time. It's slightly different. I think that's good. I feel quite confident on this because I know that Pinter was a very well-known, avowed anti-racist campaigner his entire life. And I feel like there is complete good intention from the author in the first place. And I think he's very clearly using Davies to expose these kind of attitudes and show this is what people think and this is the kind of people that think that. And do you want to be a person that thinks like that? The whole play, from Davies' perspective, is about fear of the outsider, fear of what's next door, fear of the other, fear. Now, what Pinter does brilliantly is he shows you that fear is partly because the world can be cruel and hard and difficult, and Davies had a difficult life. But Pinter is not excusing him from saying those things. Pinter's quite judgmental about it. And Pinter chooses a Buddha as the kind of symbol of harmony, of comfort. The one item in the entire room that is elegant, as it were, is a statue of the Buddha. To my mind, Pinter is going, there is this ugly underbelly of deeply racist, xenophobic strain amongst the poorest and the most vulnerable in society. He's not excusing that behavior at all, but he's going, partly that is because they are downtrodden and have no sense of worth and are basically beaten up by society. Because Mick and Aston don't, well, there's a moment where Mick says, you were over there, weren't you, in the colonies, weren't you? And clearly Mick is taking the Mickey, as it were, out of Davies. And Aston feels uncomfortable and he never joins in any of that kind of diatribe. He moves away in the text very clearly when Davies is on those things. And he doesn't get drawn into that.
I think there's no question that Pinter is not condoning Davies' attitude. He's calling it out.
Yeah.
By way of background, as a reminder of the tenor of the times that Pinter was writing the play in 1960, people will know the British Nationality Act was passed in 1948, granted British citizenship to all Commonwealth citizens. And this resulted, of course, in a huge influx of people from the Caribbean, Africa, and India, among others. Windrush, most famously from the Caribbean. And given the source of these unexpected volumes of immigrants, it became viewed as a racial problem. In the 1950s in London, it was not unknown for there to be signs in boarding houses' windows saying no blacks, no dogs, and that sort of thing. And there were race riots in Notting Hill in 1958. That's 2 years before he's writing this play, not very far from where he's living. So that's the background. I think people probably had more license to be able to say it explicitly at that time, which is something I think it reminds us in the audience that that was going on. It may make us wonder how much has changed. We may be not as explicit, but that some of these attitudes and issues are still there. And in fact, I was going to say, Justin, Davies' remarks are not just about race, as you've already pointed out, but immigration potentially more generally, because he says at one point he can't get a seat at the cafe where he's working because all them blacks had it. Blacks, Greeks, Poles, the lot of them. That's what, doing me out of a seat, treating me like dirt, all them aliens had it. And he talks, as you said earlier, about getting a job in a cafe in Wembley where they're trying to do away with these foreigners. They want an Englishman to pour their tea. I mean, this sort of sentiment doesn't sound that unfamiliar to us, does it?
I mean, again, that sense of seething resentment.
People, as you said, in straitened economic circumstances, finding someone to blame. Oh my gosh, that's a theme for today, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I didn't feel like there's any need to gloss, change, alter. That strain of, as you say, finding someone to blame, scapegoatism, or whatever you want to call it, I'm sure it runs through other societies as well, but it definitely is a thing that runs through English society. Pinter took up arms against fascist groups in East London. He knows that this language was used against his ancestors, his Jewish ancestry. He knows that this had happened to the Irish, this has happened to the Chinese community. And this was the next stage, was it was happening to the Afro-Caribbean community.
Yeah, I mean, well, it goes back to where we started. This is certainly speaking to today and that theme. One of the other themes you touched on was about dreams, hopes and dreams, and that each of these three characters seem to have some kind of idealized hope of something they'd like to achieve. But what they have in common, perhaps, is that they're all very unlikely to do so. Is that fair?
Oh, I've got a sneaky hunch that Aston is going to, I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be a great shed, but I do think he's going to get the shed built.
Do you really?
I don't think he's going to get the house renovated, I'll be honest.
Oh, I think you're a sentimentalist, even with the shed. But of course, the shed is representative. You say symbolic. He keeps repeating that if I could just get this shed, I'd love to build this shed. But I have to clear the garden first. And Davies looks out the window and the garden is feet high. He says, you're going to need a tractor. There's no way you feel like that's an imminent prospect that he's going to be able to build this shed. But I love the fact that you have the hope.
I think the shed might get built. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything in the house is ever getting done.
Well, there's a serious point, is there, that I suppose it's the poignancy of unrealized dreams. You know, we devise illusory narratives or distractions or dreams to survive our day-to-day challenges and to maintain some positive idea of a future or identity or purpose. But these look pretty forlorn, these ones.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true. I mean, Davies is never getting to Sidcup.
No, you're right.
Mick's probably not getting his copper blue parchment linoleum.
No, we talked earlier about the setting as well, and how it's disconnected from the world to some degrees. And it did put me in mind a bit of Beckett, where they're waiting for something, some transformative change in their existence. Davies really struck me that he could be a character straight out of Beckett, shuffling along in his disheveled suit, attempting to maintain some incongruous image of civility in the face of utter desolation, really.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Pinter was very open about his debts to Beckett. There's an amazing essay in Pinter's collected prose and poetry where it talks about, I think Malone Dies is the book that he finds in a library somewhere, and he steals it, Beckett's novel. And he writes in his diary about the sensation, how he felt reading that novel. This is years before, but it just had such an effect on him.
Fascinating. Let's talk about how the play ends. I mean, you touched on it before, and we may be a little bit explicit here, but let's see. Davies has somewhat overplayed his hand, I think, particularly because he switches his allegiance to Mick, but then he insults Aston to the point that Aston tells him to leave. Davies then appeals to Mick, saying, I can be your caretaker, but Mick rejects his appeal and leaves Davies desperately trying to renegotiate with Aston to let him stay. And the last image we have is Davies running out of words in his vain appeal, pleading, what am I going to do? Aston is standing with his back to him, unresponsive. How do you interpret the ending?
So I really do think that Davies is kicked out, because Aston says several times, you talk too much, I won't swap beds. He's definitive, and his speech patterns throughout the rest of the play are not definitive. So from my mind, that's why I think he has changed, because actually he's got this hard line. Now, it is open to interpretation, because the stage direction does not have Davies leave the stage. He is still in the room at the end, but because Aston is not looking at him and looking out the window, I do think Davies has to then go back into the street. What happens between Mick and Aston, I don't know.
I would say there's no question, because he has insulted Aston. He's called him essentially a nutcase to his face. Aston has a strength that he won't tolerate that. And as you say, he's bothered him already, his sleeplessness and all that stuff. But what's interesting, I think, as you say, is between Mick and Aston is how that unfolds, because Mick could have just kicked him out, but he leaves, and he leaves it to Aston to carry on. And there's this moment, I think, in the stage direction, there's an understanding smile between them.
Yes.
The brothers. It's a kind of moment of trust, and that's really powerful. It goes back to what I think you're saying about the love between the brothers, that Mick has enough respect for Aston in some way to let him determine what happens in this house.
Absolutely.
He says at some point he's got his own ideas, let him have them.
Yep.
Although it doesn't look like there's going to be much transformation in their lives, there is at least that in terms of the bond between the brothers.
That's how I would read it as well, Douglas.
And you're right, but you can't but have some sympathy for Davies, because the prospect of his being on the street again is grim, and his desperation is pretty despairing.
I mean, we know he said several times, I would have been done in then if you hadn't intervened with that Scotch git. He says another time, he says, I could have been done in on the road there. He's going back to a life of precarity and violence, vulnerability.
No question. Without even a good pair of shoes.
Without even a good pair of shoes. It's really hard because the other part of you goes, but he's totally brought that on himself.
Yes, absolutely. He is the architect of his own misfortune in that regard. He was given the kindness, the generosity of Aston, which also we didn't talk about, but is extraordinary as well, that he invites this guy in and lets him stay.
And goes and gets him clothes, gets him shoes.
Yes, exactly. And he's abused that.
And money, gives him money.
Yes. Great. Well, that is the end. Thank you so much, Justin. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover on the podcast, or one that's just a personal favorite. So I wonder if you might just volunteer one for our listeners that you love.
I've got two. I'm not allowed to, am I?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so one very contemporary play that I loved and one classical play that I love. So the contemporary play that I loved was Red Pitch, which was Terrell Williams's play, which they did at the Bush and then transferred to the West End. It's a fantastic, brilliant play about three young men growing up in a city as they watch their neighborhood become gentrified, and it centers around a football pitch. And it's a brilliant play. You don't have to care about football at all.
No, it's brilliant. We covered it on the podcast.
Oh,
yeah. I talked to Tyrrell and Daniel Bailey, who directed it. And I'm so pleased for their success.
Yeah, it's thoroughly deserved. And then I suppose the classical play I'm going to choose, because it's just a play that has had a massive influence on my life, would be 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, John Ford's play.
Why has that had an influence on your life?
Well, it is one of those where we slightly madly at my school, we did it when I was 16. And I guess it was the first time that I had a real connection to classical language in terms of saying it, and the richness and the ambiguity and the sophistication, but the visceralness of that language is amazing. And it's both an incredible thriller, but it also has such interesting, profound moral quandaries and arguments within it that I just think it's a brilliant, brilliant play.
It's a great suggestion. It's one we must have on the catalog sometime, so we will seek it out. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Douglas.
Justin's production of The Caretaker continues at the Minerva Theatre in Chichester until the 13th of July. And if you'd like to hear more about Pinter, we have episodes on his two short plays, The Collection and The Lover, his next full-length play, The Homecoming, and on his later play, Betrayal. So as the curtain falls on the desperate Davies, who finds himself again out on the street, we may feel some sympathy for his pathetic plight. But we also recognize that his fate is in part at least attributable to his own moral equivocations. It is not the Greeks, the Poles, or the Blacks who are responsible for his failures or degradation. In fact, he turned on the one kindness offered to him by Aston, a figure whose innocence has been unjustly trammeled more than once. Although the brother's own future does not promise any transformative change, we do take heart from the fact that finally Davies' prejudice and selfishness were no match for the bond of love and respect between them. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.